There was a time when the sky above our cities burned orange every night. The furnaces never slept, and neither did the men who fed them. Steel was not just an industry. It was the blood in the veins of this nation. We poured it into bridges that crossed impossible rivers and buildings that scraped the clouds. Then, somewhere between the fire and the prophet, we let those cathedrals of flame become tombs. When the soldiers came home in 1945, they returned to a nation that had just proven something extraordinary. We had outproduced the entire world. Europe was rubble and ash. Japan's cities were flattened. The Marshall Plan demanded reconstruction on a scale never before attempted, and steel was the only language that rebuilding spoke. In 1947, American furnaces produced 77 million tons of raw steel. The world needed railroads to replace the ones that had been bombed into twisted metal. It needed bridges to span rivers where bridges no longer stood. It needed the frames of apartment blocks and factories and hospitals. The Open Hearth furnaces of Pennsylvania and Indiana ran day and night because there was no time for rest. Every ton of steel we poured became a beam in the skeleton of the new world. The Bessemer process that had built 19th century America was now being pushed to its absolute limits. Men worked in conditions that turned their lungs gray and their hands into maps of scars, but the paychecks were steady, and the work felt like something larger than survival. It felt like destiny. We were not just making steel. We were forging the foundation of what we believed would be permanent American dominance. The ore came from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, transported by rail and shipped to the furnaces that never stopped burning. Coal from West Virginia and Pennsylvania fed the coke ovens that ran continuously. The chemistry was simple, but the execution required precision and courage. Iron ore, coke, and limestone fed into blast furnaces that reached temperatures of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. By 1950, production had climbed to 87 million tons annually. Pittsburgh became a city where night never truly fell. The glow from the blast furnaces along the Monongahela River painted the clouds red and orange. You could read a newspaper at midnight without a lamp. Fathers came home with burns stippling their forearms and soot embedded so deep in their skin that no soap could reach it. The smell of coke and molten iron clung to their work clothes like a second skin that their children learned to recognize before they could recognize faces. This was the cost of middle-class prosperity, and every family paid it without complaint. In Gary, Indiana, the mills stretched for miles along Lake Michigan's southern shore. The United States Steel Corporation employed over 30,000 workers there by 1953. The ground trembled constantly from ladles carrying 300 tons of liquid steel moving on overhead cranes. The sound was deafening, a symphony of hammers and pouring metal and machinery that never paused. Men worked 12-hour shifts in heat that reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit near the Open Hearth furnaces. The air itself became thick and hard to breathe. Leather boot soles cracked and separated after 3 months. Gloves had to be replaced weekly. The heat was so intense it created its own weather inside the mills, sudden downdrafts and updrafts that could knock a man off balance. But a steel worker could buy a house, a car, and send his children to college on a single income. The mills were building the American middle class one paycheck at a time. The union contracts guaranteed not just wages, but dignity, health care, pensions, the promise that if you gave your body to the furnace would take care of you when your body finally gave out. In Youngstown, Ohio, the sheet and tube company became the heart of the community. 3 generations worked side by side. Grandfathers taught fathers who taught sons the choreography of survival on the furnace floor. How to read the color of molten metal to know when it was ready to tap. White hot meant 2,800 degrees. Orange meant it was cooling and the chemistry was changing. How to move when the slag overflowed and threatened to engulf everything in its path. The men developed a particular rolling gait from years of walking across floors that buckled from thermal expansion. Their hands were living testaments to the dangers they faced, scarred and calloused and marked by burns that never fully healed. But they built everything that mattered. The Golden Gate Bridge hung on cables made from American steel. The Empire State Building stood on beams poured in Pennsylvania. When the interstate highway system was authorized in 1956, it required millions of tons of reinforcing bars and structural steel, and every ounce came from furnaces that never went cold. The steel went into the Chrysler Building and the rockets that would eventually touch the moon. It went into the destroyers and aircraft carriers that projected American power across every ocean. It went into the farm equipment that fed the world and the oil rigs that powered it. There was not a single aspect of modern life that did not rest on American steel. By 1953, American production exceeded 100 million tons annually. The mills operated at maximum capacity. Orders arrived faster than the furnaces could fulfill them. Steel executives stopped worrying about competition because there was no competition. We produced more than half the world's steel, and the world could not get enough. Detroit needed steel for automobiles that were growing larger and more chrome-covered every year. The suburbs exploding across the landscape needed steel for appliances and infrastructure. Refrigerators and washing machines and the frameworks of ranch houses spreading across former farmland. The military needed steel for aircraft carriers and jet fighters and the vast architecture of Cold War preparedness. Then, in 1973, something remarkable and terrible happened simultaneously. American steel production reached its absolute peak at 137 million tons. It was the highest mountain we would ever climb. That same year, the first oil crisis struck, and the economy shuddered. But even as we stood at the summit, celebrating numbers that seemed to prove our invincibility, the ground beneath us had already begun to crack. We believed the fire would never go out. We believed the orders would never stop coming. We believed that American steel was eternal because it had always been there, glowing red in the darkness, the sound of hammers and furnaces forming the heartbeat of industrial civilization itself. But we had made a choice years earlier that guaranteed our fall. In 1952, Austrian engineers had invented the basic oxygen furnace. It could produce steel in 45 minutes instead of the 8 to 12 hours required by traditional open hearth methods. It used less fuel. It produced cleaner steel with more consistent carbon content. Japan adopted the technology immediately after the war as they rebuilt their industrial capacity. By 1960, Japanese mills were producing steel at half the cost of American mills. European manufacturers followed. They installed basic oxygen furnaces and continuous casting machines that eliminated entire stages of production. The continuous casting process alone reduced production time and improved yield by 15 to 20%. American executives knew about these developments. They read the engineering reports. They understood the mathematics of efficiency. And they made a calculation that condemned an entire industry. Retooling would require massive capital investment. The old open hearth furnaces still worked. The order books were still full. Why spend billions modernizing when quarterly profits were strong and shareholders were satisfied? This was the original sin. We chose short-term comfort over long-term survival, and by the time we realized our mistake, it was too late to correct it. The Japanese and Europeans were not just producing cheaper steel. They were producing better steel with fewer defects and more precise specifications. Through the 1970s, foreign steel flooded American ports. Japanese imports were cheaper and often superior in quality. They required fewer man-hours to produce. Their mills were newer, cleaner, more automated. American companies responded not by modernizing their mills, but by cutting costs wherever possible. Maintenance was deferred. Safety equipment went unrepaired even as the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, created in 1970, issued new regulations. Enforcement was inconsistent, and fines were often cheaper than compliance. The companies did the math and decided that paying penalties was more profitable than preventing injuries. The men on the furnace floors noticed the changes first. Equipment that once was replaced now was patched and jury-rigged. Cranes that should have been retired kept running with failing brakes and fraying cables. Production quotas increased even as the workforce shrank through attrition. Every worker had to do more with less. Safety meetings became perfunctory rituals. Workers who raised concerns about dangerous conditions found themselves on overnight shifts or simply unemployed. The furnaces were being run into the ground to extract every possible dollar before the inevitable collapse that everyone could see coming, but no one would acknowledge. Then in 1977, Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced the closure of its Campbell Works. 5,000 jobs vanished in a single day. Men who had worked there for 30 years received 2 weeks' notice. No severance packages, no retraining programs. Just a pink slip and the realization that loyalty meant nothing when the balance sheet turned red. The decision came from corporate headquarters in a distant city. Executives who had never felt furnace heat or breathed air thick with particulates decided that the numbers no longer justified operation. The workers offered to buy the mill themselves, to take pay cuts, to do whatever was necessary to keep it running. The answer was no. By 1982, steel imports accounted for over 26% of the domestic market. Bethlehem Steel began closing mills. United States Steel shut down facilities across Pennsylvania. The company that had once been synonymous with American industrial might was abandoning the very cities it had built. Between 1979 and 1986, more than 300,000 steelworkers lost their jobs. Entire towns built around the mills collapsed. Youngstown's population dropped by 20% in a decade. Homes were abandoned, main streets emptied. The tax base evaporated, and schools closed and hospitals struggled. The suicide rate climbed as men who had defined themselves by their work found themselves purposeless in an economy that no longer valued what they knew how to do. They had given their bodies to the furnaces, their lungs and their hands and their backs, and in return, they received nothing. The pensions they had been promised were suddenly in jeopardy as the companies declared bankruptcy. What killed American steel was not just foreign competition. It was arrogance. It was the belief that dominance earned through one generation's sacrifice would last forever without continued effort and investment. It was the refusal to modernize when modernization was still possible and affordable. It was greed. The decision by executives and shareholders to extract maximum profit in the short term rather than invest in long-term survival. The money that should have gone into new furnaces went instead into dividends and executive compensation. The mills were strip-mined for profit and then discarded when there was nothing left to take. Today, the old mill sites stand as monuments to rust and broken promises. Some of the blast furnaces remain, too expensive to demolish, too contaminated to repurpose. Vines grow through shattered windows. Birds nest in the massive structures where molten steel once flowed like rivers of fire. The Monongahela no longer glows red at night. The air above Pittsburgh is clean enough now to see stars. But walk through those ruins and you can still feel the weight of what was lost. The silence is oppressive in places that once roared with the sound of creation. The men who worked. Those furnaces are old now. Their lungs still carry the particulates that show up on medical scans like ghosts. Their hands still bear the scars that map out decades of dangerous labor. They remember when America made things, when you could draw a direct line between your work and the world you inhabited. They remember the heat that melted boot soles and the pride that came from knowing your steel was holding up bridges and buildings that would outlast you. They remember the weight of the ladles and the choreography of the pour, and the moment when liquid metal hit the molds and sparked like captured lightning. If you remember that time, if you stood outside a mill at shift change and watched thousands of men pour into the streets covered in soot and sweat, if the sound of furnaces and drop hammers formed the rhythm of your childhood, we want to hear from you. If you knew someone who died or was maimed in those firelit caverns where we forged the bones of modern civilization, share their story. Tell us what it meant when your father came home smelling of coke and iron. Help us remember what was lost when the fires finally went cold and the silence settled over the valleys where America once made steel.